In his new book, The Way of Heaven and Earth, From Either Or to the Catholic Both And, Matthew Becklo explains, quote, "The Catholic faith is full of paradoxes, but its greatest paradox is this, that all of its both ands unleash this ultimate either or, and all of its communion compels this unavoidable decision, this cutting away of either death or life. Either we are with Christ or we are against him. Either we gather with him or we are scattered without him. Either we enter the perfect peace of the way of heaven and earth, or we succumb to the endless division of Satan and in the end lose everything." Close quote. Matthew Becklo, on the exquisite balance found in the Catholic faith, the way of heaven and earth, now. My name is Todd Warner, and this is the Evangelization Culture Podcast from Word on Fire. Matthew Becklo is a husband and father, writer and editor, and the publishing director for Bishop Robert Barron's Word on Fire Catholic Ministries. He is the author of The Way of Heaven and Earth, From Either Or to the Catholic Both And. He has also contributed essays for Wisdom and Wonder, How Peter Kraft Shaped the Next Generation of Catholics, and The New Apologetics, Defending the Faith in a Post-Christian Era. He has also edited multiple books, including The Holy Hour, Meditations for Eucharistic Adoration, and the Flannery O'Connor Collection. His writing has been featured in Catholic World Report, Catholic Answers, National Catholic Register, Inside the Vatican Magazine, and of course our very own Evangelization Culture Journal, and has also appeared online at First Things, The Catholic Thing, and The Catholic Herald. Matthew lives in New York with his wife, Elizabeth, and their 4 children. Matt, welcome.
Thank you, Todd. Great to be with you.
Segment 1, The Dilemma of Man. In the opening pages of The Way of Heaven and Earth, Matt Becklo writes, quote, "Man is a divided animal. Division, of course, has always been with us, but the speed, frequency, and intensity with which he can now share ideas has brought us to a crisis of polarization, one that more and more threatens the future of civilization. Whether it's religion, philosophy, culture, politics, or art, we find ourselves in a fiercely divided world. Divided countries, divided states, divided communities, divided families, divided minds. And as Pope Benedict XVI once observed, there is no escape from the dilemma of being a man," close quote. So Matt, first of all, I got to tell people, Matt is a good friend through Word on Fire. So this is just a joy to have you on here. And so if there's a little bit of humorous towel snapping, it just comes from being together over the many years. But I also, it's just such a joy also to celebrate such an extraordinary book, The Way of Heaven and Earth. I want to ask you, just in reading this great book, how did you first find yourself interested in the divisions in and the dilemmas of being a man?
Yeah, thank you again, Todd, for having me on. It's great to finally talk with you about the book. I know we've been trying to get this together for a while. Yeah. This book really is, as I think I say in the introduction, it's sort of the project of a lifetime. Mm-hmm. I've been working on it for over a decade now. It's tied into my own, experiences, being raised as a Catholic, drifting away from the faith for a period of time, rediscovering the faith in college, and sort of undergoing this profound reversion experience. And then shortly thereafter, I discovered Bishop Barron and Word on Fire, then Father Barron through YouTube. And so Father Barron would talk often about the Catholic both and that phrase just resonated so profoundly with me. It kind of hit on all these different things that philosophically I had been wrestling with. One of the biggest being the question that I get into the first part of, are human beings spiritual or are they physical? Are we spirit or flesh? I was wrestling with that in terms of the great philosophers of the Western tradition. So to hear this idea of the Catholic both and to hear it brought forward so beautifully and truthfully just opened up this whole pattern of thinking for me that I feel like I was craving and I didn't even know it. So I discovered it in the Catholic tradition. We were talking before we went on about Chesterton. So Chesterton, he came up quicker than expected, but he's one of the first people that I read after Walker Percy during my reversion. It was Walker Percy's Lost in the Cosmos, which I had to quote right away in the book, but then Chesterton's Orthodoxy. So Chesterton, of course, is the great Prince of Paradox, and so many of his writings get into this theme of the Catholic both and, of opposites being held together in the Christian faith. So it really stretches back many, many years for me. My question that I was wrestling with is, well, what is the Catholic both and? What defines this pattern of thinking? How can we sort of bring all these different dilemmas together into a sort of a framework, into a hermeneutic that people can take and use? My early attempts at figuring that out, I think, sort of stalled out. I was trying to pin everything on a certain thinker or a certain dilemma. Over time, I came to see heaven and earth are really the master categories that I was working within, and then the book sort of flowed out from that.
Matt, I want to ask you, because this is a book that's absolutely a tour de force on philosophy and theology. I mean, and it's very approachable, which is an incredible, first of all, it's a very novel idea of what you're describing throughout these, I think, 26 chapters. Second of all, you really do a nice job giving brief but thoughtful treatment to deeper philosophical concepts and deeper theological concepts. I mentioned this later on I will mention this later on in our conversation about how steeped you seem in both philosophy and theology. I want to ask you just two things. You're wrestling with big questions. Many people who are kind of debating the faith themselves at a younger age, if they've fallen away and they're in the process of a reversion, are not necessarily wrestling with the notion of the both and of the spirit and the flesh. My question for you is, do you have a background in philosophy and theology that led you to that kind of pressing question? And could you say a word or two about your reversion? Kind of were there a couple of linchpins? As I like to say, was it 1,000 strokes, 1,000 paint strokes on a portrait, or was it a little bit more of a lightning bolt knocking you off your horse? So two questions: philosophical, theological background that brought you to the question you were asking, and secondly, a word or two, if that's possible, on your own reversion.
Yeah, and they're sort of tied together because I was raised Catholic. I said in an interview recently, my upbringing as a Catholic was really as close to ideal as you could have. It would be easy for me to look back and say, oh, this is what went wrong and why I drifted away. Well, I think, as we read in the Liturgy of the Hours, stay sober and alert. The devil's prowling, looking for someone to devour. And I was raised in this great Catholic family, great Catholic parish. But, the influence of the world, the flesh, and the devil over time, it was just this drifting away into worldliness that happened. Kind of around the same time as I was drifting away, I started discovering philosophy. And in my mind, the Catholic faith was sort of this homey, provincial, sort of narrow way of looking at things that was rooted in, tradition, culture. It wasn't really a serious-minded way of approaching the big questions. So both philosophy and religion in my mind were dealing with the big questions, but religion was kind of a short-circuiting or a shortcut to an answer in my mind. And philosophy, on the other hand, was rigorous. It was tough-minded. It was something a lot more adventurous. So that was my perspective as I was drifting away. I started to discover philosophy in high school. I started asking, the big questions that we all wrestle with. Who are we? Why are we here? What's the meaning of life? And that, asking about existence led me into existentialism. So sort of my first foray into philosophy was reading Jean-Paul Sartre, Nietzsche, but also on the Christian side, Kierkegaard, Pascal, names like that are sort of the people that I was reading. I was trying to carve out my own path philosophically to understand the meaning of life. Inevitably, as the point I'm making in the book is that we just fall into these awful either or dilemmas. Whether you're pursuing that from a rationalistic perspective or you're just going on instinct and feeling, you're going to fall into these dilemmas. And I certainly did. How did my reversion come about? It was process of the intellect and the heart. Another dilemma that's important to me because both of those things played a factor in my coming back to the faith. So as I mentioned, reading Walker Percy, Chesterton, but there were also, aspects of my moral life, my spiritual life that needed healing. There was a profound experience of turning to God in prayer at one point, maybe praying for the first time in my life in a way that I hadn't as a young man. So to your second question, really the latter. It was a lot of different things that converged at one time, I think.
It's wonderful. And people listening to this, I want to reinforce. Matt's one of the smartest guys I know, and what's interesting about this, I think, is plenty of people out there that think that if you probe Catholicism with those tough questions, or probe religion with those tough questions, well, religion's just a fairy tale. It's not gonna end where I want it to. It's going to be this kind of sad and kind of weak sauce, when in fact it's a profound banquet. The deeper that you dig, the more profound the truths are. And as your book gives evidence to, it finds profound reconciliations on the biggest and the toughest of questions. Not that there isn't still mystery and ineffability and so on, but your book is an extraordinary testimony about the search for truth, and not finding it in the variations that spin off of religion, but finding it in the Catholic faith in and of itself. I want to ask you, Matt. Oh, by the way, it was funny because when you were saying that you were trying to kind of find your way and so on. Again, you made me think of the Chestertonian. I thought I was ahead of my age, only to realize I thought I had formed a creed of my own. I was a heretic, and only to realize that I was following the orthodoxy of the Catholic Church, which had been there 1,800 years before.
Exactly.
We always kind of, truly, if when God is out there, and He is always out there, and we're earnestly seeking, it seems like we find ourselves back in His arms when we think we're rebelling and so on. So it's a wonderful Chestertonian way.
And there's 1,000 different doors into the church, as he said. So, that's right. Yeah, absolutely.
That's right. So Matt, I want to ask you, back to that original quote that we opened this section about, all this man is a divided animal. Why are we so divided? And is this something that originates in the fall and is perpetuated by our continued dislocation from God? What would you say about where this division comes from?
Yes, would be my answer. So Bishop Barron has this quote that he often brings out from Origen of Alexandria, and he says, where there is sin, there is division. I think he says there's fragmentation, there is schism. So he's basically saying that, this idea of sin and division go hand in hand. Another thing that Bishop Barron likes to point out is that the name of Satan means the scatterer. So there's this sense in which evil is a scattering force. It turns people against one another, whereas Christ is this gathering force. He beautifully unfurls that in his book, The Priority of Christ, talking about Christ as the gatherer. Christ brings this harmony, this unity, God through Christ drawing the world, drawing humanity to himself, whereas Satan is the dividing force. So I do think it is just the nature of living in a fallen world. One of the great things I've wrestled with in terms of the book, which is itself a sort of either or pull, is this sort of baked into the metaphysical structure of reality, or is this sort of a existential psychological projection onto our experience? Is it something subjective or objective that we fall into these dilemmas? Of course, I think it's both. I think we're going out to meet a world that, as I say, heaven and earth is the great contrast. The way that I laid out in the book is God and man, God's place and man's place. And then if you look at this world, there's the spiritual and the physical, and then the human being is a microcosm of that, the spirit and the flesh. So we do go out to meet a world that has these distinctions, it has these contrasts. But then also our patterns of thinking, I just found the more that I dug into this both and question, the more that I looked at some of the great debates of philosophy and theology, it just recurs again and again. It's almost like a tick that we can't help falling into. And again, I think the power of this hermeneutic of saying Christ is the way of heaven and earth is that it always draws those divisions, it always draws those dilemmas back into a sort of primordial harmony that they're meant to be together. We don't quite get there because we do live in a fallen world. I think you see that mistake too in some of the errors, some of the heresies I point out in the book, is that people try to get to this harmony and this synthesis, this perfection of reality that we're just not going to get this side of heaven, because we do live in a fallen reality.
You made mention of this, and this is exactly what I wanted to go into to begin with, the notion of that the greatest dilemmas are these heaven-earth dilemmas, and you highlighted, and you just rattled them off pretty quickly there, the four great dilemmas. Can you say a few words about each of the four great heaven-earth dilemmas?
Yes, absolutely. So I think I mentioned at the outset, I was struggling to come up with a framework that would gather all the both ands, all the Catholic both ands together. And I don't remember when it happened or how it happened, but all of a sudden I found myself writing a book called The Way of Heaven and Earth. And so heaven and earth, of course, in the opening chapter of Genesis, we read, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So there's this great, what's called a merism, these two contrasting halves that come together to form a greater whole. It's the ultimate merism. It's the ultimate image of the scriptures that runs from that very first chapter of Genesis all the way to the end of the book of Revelation, where we see the new heavens and the new earth. Mm-hmm. But what I love about the terms is that there's a certain elasticity to them in the scriptures. So sometimes the word heaven will be used as a sort of stand-in for the word God. We see that in the Gospel of Matthew, for example. But then also you see this tight correlation. Then I should say heaven and earth. What most of us mean by those terms is quote unquote God's place and our place. So it's the transcendent world of God and then our world here below. But then you also see God, as I mentioned, being used for heaven. There's this tight correlation between the earthly and the human. So Adam, of course, in the book of Genesis, is formed from the dust of the earth. All these different linguistic, all these different images and metaphors all sort of gather around these pairs coming together. But then also you have the angels, spiritual reality, and then also the physical reality of the universe. These two halves coming together in the human person as well. And those are all sort of intimately related to the first two of God and man and God's place and man's place. So you can kind of hear by the way I'm sort of weaving in and out of them that they do intersect, they do connect in a really mysterious way. And the scriptures are constantly, I think, moving in and out of those polarities. But in my mind, when you say heaven and earth, you're kind of dealing with all four at once under this image of the physical universe, of the sky and the ground, the heavens and the earth.
Yeah, it's great. The one thing I love about this book is you highlight, here it is. Yes. The people of heaven and earth, God and man, the places of heaven and earth, God's place and man's place. And then you specifically go down to the earth side, man's place, the spiritual and the physical, and then man himself, the spirit and the flesh. This is unfolding in such an articulate fashion, these kind of, like you said, these poles, and then how we find ourselves drawn towards one pole or drawn towards another pole, and sometimes falling somewhat out of balance. When you're highlighting these heaven and earth dilemmas, Matt, your next premise is it's resolved. There is a resolution of this. I mean, some might say, my gosh, we're living in this constant state of tension and we're going to be stuck there and there's not really an answer and then we die. And yet you said it's resolved in Christ. So I know, again, the book explores this, but can you, and I know this is like saying, well, wrap up why Christ is. So I'm not expecting you to do that. The first answer is go read this book because Matt just marches through and unfolds this. But give us a sense as to how you arrived at the notion that these dilemmas are resolved in Christ. And I promise you, the rest of this podcast we're going to unfold all this. But just to start us off, how are those dilemmas resolved, particularly in the God man of Jesus Christ?
Yeah, and I'm certainly a better writer than speaker. I don't know how good of a writer, but certainly better.
Great at both. Great at both.
So I would direct people to the book, but So the first, it's really three interrelated ideas that I lay out, as you said in the introduction. And the first, we sort of talked about that our greatest dilemmas come back to these heaven earth dilemmas. And I go through, as you say, about 26 of them in the book. And sometimes within a chapter, there's multiple, if you're kind of picking these up, there's multiple subcategories within those. And even beyond that, there's so many other dilemmas that didn't quite make it into the book that I think there's a lot more we can go on. That's the first premise. And the second one is that all of these different heaven earth dilemmas that we face, going back to these four ultimate dilemmas, are resolved in Christ. Mm-hmm. And he calls himself the way, which I put as the epigraph of the book from John 14:6. I think when most of us hear that phrase, he says, I am the way, we think of Christ as sort of a bridge, as sort of a path of getting from humanity to God, from this world up to the heavenly world. And that's not wrong. I think there's a sense in which that's true. But I think you also interestingly see the way being used as the early phrase to capture what Christianity is, what the whole belief in Christ, following Christ, the whole pattern of life that comes with being a Christian in the Acts of the Apostles is called the way. And we don't quite know, based on at least my, own ignoramus brief research, is that we don't quite know what that meant. I think there was like different philosophical movements that would use that term in a similar way in the air. So it was sort of in the cultural milieu that people talked about a way or living this way and that way. But Christianity is the way. So the way that I wanted to read that was saying Christ is the way of heaven and earth. He brings all of these polarities together in himself. And sort of one of the master verses in my mind as I work through that, which again recurs again and again in the Liturgy of the Hours, Ephesians 1:10, Colossians 1:20, says, God in Christ gathers all things in heaven and on earth into himself, reconciles all things, making peace through the blood of his cross. That to me is who Christ is. That's just what Christianity is. Christ gathers heaven and earth together in himself. Well, how does he do that? I think obviously we tend to think of the both and of the way of heaven and earth in incarnational terms. So I think certainly the coming together of that first polarity of God and man in Christ is the incarnation. But then also, it doesn't, in my mind, that's sort of it's the center, sort of the start, the sort of energy of this whole thing is the incarnation. So that is a primary point of reference. But it's almost like it just goes out in concentric circles from there. So God's place and man's place. I mentioned the new heavens and the new earth in the book of Revelation. So at the end of time, and Paul beautifully says this will happen in and through Christ. All of his enemies will be put under his feet. All things will be gathered to God through Christ in the end of time. But then also, in this sort of passing world that we live in, we have the spiritual and the physical coming together and the sacraments. So the sacramental is another lens through which, as Catholics, we often talk about the both and, the Eucharist, baptism, all the other sacraments. And then, of course, the resurrection, the rising of Christ's body and soul. And in him and in his resurrection, we see the hope for our own resurrection, body and soul at the end of time. So those are sort of the four, if you want, the four moments of Christ that I look at in terms of resolving those polarities. But in my mind, it's just always Christocentric. It's always looking at the entirety of who Christ is as resolving all these dilemmas of heaven and earth.
What's amazing is in reading this book, it's almost like looking at one of those bubble paintings that when you kind of cross your eyes just a little bit, you see the figure emerge in kind of three dimensions. And I'm not saying you need to be cross-eyed when you read your book, but what I am saying,
it might make you cross-eyed.
No. What I am saying is that you unfold for us these pairings, these I want to say dyads, but these dilemmas, if you will. You see it again and again and again. You're like, I guess I never saw that before, and now I do. I never saw that before, and now I do. And you just recognize, like you said, God, man. Jesus arrives in the incarnation as a God, man, fully human, fully divine. He resurrects body and spirit. His death on the cross serves both justice and mercy. There's these perfect reconciliations again and again and again. Even Chesterton talks about the cross being, this clash of the vertical that bridges the gap between heaven and earth, and the horizontal of the bar of the cross that basically reaches from man to man, woman to woman, and so on. So your book really makes it apparent that the intersection of all these contrasts, Christ is at the center of, and you did such a nice job of that. So then I'm going to move into wearing my Protestant hat, or my unbelieving.
I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, my unbelieving hat. And what happens? And what happens is I say, so that you assert that the fullness of the way is in the Catholic Church. And again, I'm a Catholic. I believe this. and you brilliantly engage us throughout the book. But for those who agree with the first two premises, that there are these great heaven earth dilemmas that, as you described, that these heaven earth dilemmas can in fact be reconciled in Christ. What do you say to the skeptic that's reluctant to say that the Catholic Church holds primacy of place when it comes to arriving at the fullness of the way, so to speak?
Well, do you mean a Christian, a Protestant skeptic, or an agnostic?
Yeah, let's say a Protestant skeptic. Let's step away from yes.
Okay, yeah, and I'm so glad you raised that. And I'm curious to hear your reaction to the book in general, but especially the Reformation chapter as a former Protestant, because it is something I wrestled with a lot as I was pulling the book together. People who read the book will see that, for example, I bring out C.S. Lewis quite a bit. I mean, he's, in my mind, had he lived longer, I think he would have found his way into the Catholic Church. That might be a controversial thing to say, but there's one line, for example, where he says that the holiest thing in the universe, aside from your neighbor, is the Eucharist. I mean, that's like a pretty Catholic thing to say in my mind. And, he has this great sense of the both and. But yeah, as I argue, the fullness of the way is in the Catholic Church. Of course, lots of arguments happen. Just go to like Catholic Answers and watch some of the Protestant Catholic, debates online, and a lot of debates about the historicity of this claim and the theology and all these different things. My whole framework in this book is obviously the both and. So I'm trying to invite Protestants to look at the Christian faith in these terms, which, again, we share some of these basic beliefs: the incarnation, the resurrection, the new heavens and the new earth, and all these fundamentals of our faith, Catholics and Protestants share. Yeah. My contention is that if you keep pressing that, you keep pressing the way of heaven and earth, you keep pressing the incarnational perspective, you're going to have to see something like the Catholic Church. You're going to have to see something like living out the way of heaven and earth in a more, what do I want to say? I guess in a more existential way in terms of our journey through this life. So it's not just a matter of, we believe certain things and we're reconciled with God and we have our hope for heaven. Of course, all those things are true, but to fully enter into what Christ has come to do as individuals, as human beings, and as a church, I think you inevitably find yourself looking at the Catholic Church. And again, to me, the principle of the both and is sort of the master principle of Catholicism. It's just taking what is this way of heaven and earth that Christ gives to us, and it's entering into it fully. It's teasing out all the different implications. It's drawing people into it in every possible way. And that's to me the great adventure of Catholicism.
Yeah, that's a wonderful answer. And I'll say as a Lutheran who became Catholic in 2010, it was my experience of the Mass, my ultimate experience of the sacraments, but also my appreciation or coming to a very obviously superficial understanding compared to the depths that are there of the deep, the profound intellectual and mystical tradition that the Catholic Church has from the time of Christ up until this very day. Not just the tradition itself, and not just the scriptural realities themselves as they manifest themselves in the sacraments and our daily practice as Catholics, but also the fact that the Catholic Church has been wrestling with these both and questions. It's funny because one of my good friends was talking about some aspect of the Catholic Church, and I'm like, well, I think they argued about that for about 30 years back in the 1300s or the 1200s, and I think there was 3 councils that addressed that. So the literature is out there for you to go and look at it. And I can say that with tongue in cheek only because I was once one of those guys that sort of was like, well, why do they do it this way, and so on and so forth. And I had no idea about my own Lutheran tradition, much less the deep waters and the many arguments and discussions that led to what our Nicene Creed is nowadays. Mm-hmm. So anyway, it's wonderfully said. And by the way, this book it's profoundly charitable in its quoting of many figures, philosophical figures, Protestant figures, as well as Catholic figures. But like you said, it points again and again to the great both and found resolved in Christ and midwifed by the custodian, which is the Catholic Church.
Yeah, and the first So the first part of the book is looking at what I call the dilemmas of life. And on the one hand, you have a pull toward what I call a heavenward direction, which, I sort of present as Gnosticism is sort of the master heavenward perspective. Then on the other hand, you have secularism, which would be the master earthward perspective. Well, the answer to these great dilemmas of life, those four categories we talked about, is Christianity. It's Christ. And I would think most Protestants will read that first section and just not disagree. There is one part where I bring forward the Eucharist. So if you don't have a Eucharistic perspective in your tradition, you might balk at that. But other than that, the first section's looking at the incarnation, the resurrection, the basics of our faith. The second section is looking at philosophical dilemmas. So if you're, steeped in the philosophical tradition, St. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas. Those are the two master figures I look to in terms of reconciling the philosophical dilemmas that the tradition has wrestled with. And again, I think what's interesting now is you look out and you see a revival happening of, even in Thomas Aquinas, there's a lot of interest among Protestants rediscovering Aquinas.
Yeah.
So again, even there in terms of philosophy, I think a lot of non-Catholics will find a lot to be interested and agree with. The rubber does meet the road in the third section, and that's where I bring forward the Catholic Church as the fullness of the way, dealing with all the different heresies in our tradition.
Segment 2, The Extremes and the Way. In his book Orthodoxy, G.K. Chesterton describes the paradoxes of Christianity, saying, quote, "Suppose we heard an unknown man spoken of by many men. Suppose we were puzzled to hear that some men said he was too tall and some too short. Some objected to his fatness, some lamented his leanness, some thought him too dark and some too fair. One explanation would be that he might be an odd shape. But there's another explanation. He might be the right shape. Outrageously tall men might feel him to be short. Very short men might feel him to be tall. Old bucks who are growing stout might consider him insufficiently filled out. Old beaux who were growing thin might feel that he expanded beyond the narrow lines of elegance. Perhaps this extraordinary thing is really the ordinary thing, at least the normal thing, the center. Perhaps, after all, it is Christianity that is sane and all its critics that are mad," close quote. So, Matt, chapter by chapter in The Way of Heaven and Earth, you explore the heavenward and the earthward poles and the dynamic tension that exists between the two. For instance, is man more beholden to his spirit or to his flesh? In the good life, what is the role of discipline versus passion? In knowledge, are we creatures of thought or experience? And in living our morality, what role is played by rigor as opposed to relaxation? So 26 mesmerizing chapters explore the way and the poles of waywardness. So first, how did you come up with all these topics with the heaven and earth dilemmas?
Yeah, it's a good question because the book went through a lot of different forms as I worked on it. Again, I've been working on it for 10 years now. So it just, anything you work on for that long is, anyone who's a writer and editor knows you're constantly throwing it out, starting over, redoing this section, turning this into that. So it was strange because I kept feeling like this dilemma or that dilemma was sort of imposing itself on the text, and I just sort of went with it. It's like, okay, here's a new chapter. And then by the time I reached the end, there were certain subcategories, like I mentioned, that I wish I'd brought forward more. But in my mind, it's like I've covered sort of everything, at least that I can see in terms of this lens. As we said, philosophy, theology, and also the great dilemmas of life. So it's interesting. I mean, I said at the outset that initially I was looking at the spirit and the flesh. I was really focused on Descartes, as somebody that I had studied quite a bit in college and wrestled with quite a bit. I was trying to create this sort of story where Descartes, if you read like Walker Percy, he talks about this, or Jacques Maritain, hangs a lot on Descartes in terms of modern thought and sort of where we went off the rails. So I was trying to sort of tie everything back to Descartes' division of thought and experience of the soul and the body. But over time, again, heaven and earth imposed themselves as really the categories that got got their arms around everything. And within that, just certain dilemmas. If you look at philosophy, you look at theology, you just can't help but notice these themes recurring. One struggle too was who to present as sort of exemplifying each side of a dilemma. Initially, I had like 3, 4, or 5 different figures. I was all over the place. And then somebody wisely who read the book said, why don't you just look at one person on each side? This is a little too much. So I bring forward one. Sometimes I sneak in a second, but for the most part, one case study on either side who, to my mind, in themselves, they sort of exemplify the error of taking one side at the expense of the other. But then also on the opposite side is a group that you find them wrestling with in the history of ideas.
So, Matt, as you have all these dilemmas, it's a book that's rich with tensions. And again, it reminds me of, once again, Chesterton's commentary about virtues, about prudence, temperance, courage, justice, virtues that are untempered by each other. And here's what Chesterton says. He says, the modern world is not evil. In some way, the modern world is far too good. It is full of wild and wasted virtues. When a religious scheme is shattered, as Christianity was shattered at the Reformation, it is not merely the vices that are let loose. The vices are indeed let loose, and they wander and do damage. But the virtues are let loose also. And the virtues wander more wildly, and the virtues do more terrible damage. The modern world is full of the old Christian virtues gone mad. The virtues have gone mad because they have been isolated from each other and are wandering alone. Thus, some scientists care for truth, and their truth is pitiless. Thus, some humanitarians only care for pity, and their pity, I am sorry to say, is often untruthful. Close quote. So Matt, I want to ask you, and your book is getting to this, why do we have a tendency towards the heavenward or the earthward extremes, and not that tendency towards the natural moderation, I shouldn't say natural, but the healthy moderation of the way?
Yeah, and I love both of those Chesterton quotes that you just read. He's so disheartening sometimes. You hear a quote and it's like, why can't I write like that? It's just so good.
I'm right there with you.
Yeah, so he's brilliant and was such a huge influence on me with the book. And I should add on C.S. Lewis, for anyone listening who might not be Catholic, Chesterton's Everlasting Man was a key influence on C.S. Lewis as well.
Right.
So he's a genius. Why do we fall into these dilemmas? I think one thing I've been thinking about, if I can bring it up to date with the election of Pope Leo, which has been really exciting, really fun to see. There's a lot we could say about it, but what I've found fascinating, again, as somebody who's very attuned to dilemmas, and it's something I've been obsessing about, I should say, for about 10 years, is that I find that with Pope Leo already in a week, he's been the Pope for a week. It's not a lot of time. He's not said or done a whole lot, but you see Catholics honing in on this word, on that theme, on this gesture, on that gesture. And it's like, and you can tell, okay, well, where are they coming from? What matters to them? Why are they so passionate about this aspect of the faith? It's something I've thought about. I think, again, we live in a fallen world. We live in a finite world. We only have so much time. We all have our own particular experiences that we go through. I think oftentimes one theme that we haven't mentioned yet is enantiodromia, which was a key idea for me in the writing of this book, which is that extremes turn into their opposites. So enantiodromia literally means opposite running. So when you start to drift into one-sided extreme, inevitably the shadow side will sort of exact its revenge and come bursting out, and so then you're flipped into the opposite extreme as a way of dealing with your former imbalance. So rather than getting a sense of the whole, you're just kind of oscillating between these two extremes. I think we all experience that in our own lives. I think a common example would be somebody who's raised in a, Chesterton in that quote beautifully brings out, pitiless truth, or a pity without truth, flipping between, compassion and an emphasis on truth.
Yeah.
I think one common example is somebody who's raised, as a fundamentalist. Let's say I deal with this in the chapter on faith and reason, but somebody who's raised to say it's all about faith, forget about Athens, forget about the philosophical tradition, just believe, and, science, leave that to the side. you believe it because the Bible says it and that's the end of it. And that's sort of fundamentalist perspective that we're familiar with. Well, I think you find that oftentimes a lot of people raised in this sort of environment will swing to the opposite extreme, and then they leave faith behind so dramatically, and then they enter into this sort of hardened rationalism where it's like faith is just blind, leaps. It's just, superstition. There's just nothing inherently sophisticated or rational about it. So yeah, I think we all are shaped by our experiences. We all get tastes of the dysfunctions on one side or the other of the dilemmas, and then so we want to emphasize the other side. It's only natural. I think the beauty of Catholicism is that it brings together all the different variegated experiences, perspectives, emphases that all kinds of different people have, and it holds them together in this beautiful tension of the one body. It keeps the whole thing from fragmenting apart because we're united in Christ. We're united through the Eucharist. All these different gifts and perspectives are held together in the Catholic whole, which to me is the beauty of it.
That's so well said, and it does make you think of the Christ, who lovingly heals, and then the Christ who has the cords and cleanses the temple. I mean, a Mary who's a strong young woman, assenting to the proposition of having this Christ child, and weathering all the storms she had to weather, and yet the Mary who is momentarily broken in the Pietà. I mean, what strikes me is, as you've said this, is in the sense of that central aspect of the way is the authenticity of a human being who's going through suffering, a human being who's experiencing joy can say, my God knows me. These saints know me. This teaching knows me. This Christ knows me, because he or they have experienced something akin to what I've experienced. And one of the things I've always found is a lot of the ideological stand-ins for religion, oftentimes when it comes to some of those big, profoundly human experiences, they're mute. They actually want to sweep them under the rug. We've got nothing to, National Socialism has nothing to say about your compassion. Communism has nothing to say about mercy in certain circumstances. And so it's striking that, as Balthazar once said, when one considers the Scripture and its addressing of fear and anxiety, the only conclusion is Scripture has no fear of fear and anxiety, because we all. So anyway, my point is, you do such a nice job of weaving between these poles and the centering of Christ's way and the Catholic Church's way as something that speaks to us in all of our experiences, and not just the experience that draws us this way or draws us that way. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's beautifully put. And again, as you were talking, I was thinking back to the Chesterton line about one of the virtues isolated and running amok and gone mad. And I think that's exactly right. It's seizing on something true. Oftentimes, some great error, some great philosophical error, some great theological heresy. One thing that I learned as I was working on the book is that I think oftentimes we'll say something like Pelagianism, or we'll talk about Pelagius, and it's like this cartoonish figure that it's like, oh, what a joke. He comes along and says, we're going to work our way to salvation, and how wrong he was. And we're all, thousands of years later. But then you read even Augustine, who was a great opponent of Pelagius, says he was this noble, worthy, upstanding, serious, moral Christian. This was not a slouch. He was not a joke. He knew his stuff. So yeah, oftentimes it's just a natural human inclination to seize on some truth, on some aspect of the faith. The key is to not so isolate it from its complement that you start going off the rails and you start forgetting that sense of harmony with the other side, based on your own experience, based on your own proclivities. It's a constant struggle, I will confess. It's not easy. It's not as if you just kind of slip into the both and it's like, oh, everything kind of fits together neatly. And you're constantly examining yourself. Am I falling one way or the other? Am I off the rails? And, look at 2,000 years of Catholic history and theology. We're all trying to get more precise in the way we talk about God and the way we talk about salvation. It's a constant struggle. But as you say, the ideological perspectives, they might offer a sense of directness and simplicity. They might sort of get us out of that struggle. But then on the other hand, you're going to end up in some pretty dark places, which I try to show in the book as well.
Yeah. I want to touch on a couple of chapters so people get a sense as to specifically what you're writing about. So let's consider, I want to go to chapter 5 for a minute, which explores man as immortal spirit or mortal flesh. So you tell us, in each of these chapters, you identify what is the heavenward way and what is the earthward way, and then what's the resolution. So you tell us that the heavenward way, spirit, at the expense of the earthward way, flesh, can lead to Gnosticism. And the earthward way, flesh, at the expense of the heavenward way, spirit, can lead to nihilism. So can you unpack this for us?
Yeah, and so that little formula was also something that sort of emerged over time. And, my worry was that it gets a little repetitive for the reader because every chapter has that tripartite sort of structure where it's, here's the heavenward way, here's the earthward way, here's the way of heaven and earth.
Right.
So it all has that same structure, but again, I found as I was working on it, like this formula just sort of imposed itself on the text, and I felt like I couldn't say what I was trying to say without working within those constraints. So it might be a little dry, repetitive way of framing it, but I think as you get into that rhythm, it's kind of unleashing this awareness of here's the dynamics. I hope it does anyway. That these are the dynamics of the struggle of ideas.
And I want to interrupt you. I want to interrupt you for a second because there is nothing but clarity in that. And the structure lends so much clarity to saying, okay, here you're tilting in this direction. Here's a body of thought. Here's a thinker. Here's an idea. Here's a philosophy that champion this. Let's unfold this. Mm-hmm. Then let's go to the other pole and do the same thing. And then let's find the resolution. I find that structure to be deeply engaging and profoundly clarifying in what can otherwise be a lot of murkiness that can lop over in between. So no, I think it's a winning formula, if I could say so.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. No, I limit myself for the most part to movements, to thinkers that are sort of in the past. So part of that is they're just the most well known, and they've emerged over time as the most emblematic of a certain dysfunction. But then also, I didn't want to bring in all this baggage. I occasionally bring it up to the present, but I didn't want all the baggage of our current debates to kind of get in the way.
Yes.
But I want people, my hope is that you read a certain dilemma, you read a certain struggle in the history of ideas, and as you read it, you're thinking, wow, like that's what this current political debate is hitting on, or that's what this theological struggle in the church that, or like a certain contemporary debate that Catholics are having, that kind of ties into that. So, Gnosticism, you mentioned the spirit and the flesh chapter. Mm-hmm. I was relying primarily on Hans Jonas's book, The Gnostic Religion, which was, I just highly recommend. It's a super illuminating book. Gnosticism is also one of these movements that we tend to make a cartoon of. We tend to just treat it as this sort of goofy error. But the Gnostic movement was like this serious, formidable opponent of the early church. And you see the church fathers again and again, Irenaeus, all these different thinkers are struggling against the Gnostic movement. Clearly, it was hitting on something, to your point before, something deep in the human experience. Mm-hmm. And I try to bring that out in the different, all the early chapters are dealing with Gnosticism, but particularly it comes to a head with the spirit or the flesh. Why does it come to a head? Because we all know what's the one guarantee in life, that we will eventually die. Mm-hmm. And Gnosticism brings this sense of when you die, your spirit is going to ascend, through the cosmic spheres. It's going to strip itself of any kind of physical, mortal attachments, and you're going to get increasingly purified as you ascend. And then your spirit will return to its spiritual home apart from this dark physical reality. Gnosticism, I should say, is often identifying the material with an evil principle. Mm-hmm. So the spirit ultimately is meant to awaken to its being imprisoned in the body. It's meant to awaken to this plight of living in the physical universe. I mentioned, not to pick on him, in the book. Maybe I do a little bit, but Rainn Wilson, who plays Dwight in The Office, he's an interesting guy. He's doing a lot of stuff about spirituality that I find interesting, and I would agree with a lot of what he says. But I've heard him in a few interviews just hit exactly on this Gnostic theme, where he says, I am a spirit. I have nothing to do with my body or this passing life. And at some point, my spirit will depart and leave it all behind. So that's sort of the Gnostic theme that obviously is still recurring today, thousands of years later. On the other side, you can say there is no spirit. There is no spiritual principle of human life. We are just bodies. I couldn't help but think of Shakespeare. I quoted him a few times in that chapter, but how can you not think of "Ow, ow, brief candle"?
Right.
That whole soliloquy and from Macbeth. We're food for worms, and that's the end. And this sort of nihilistic despair that creeps in, without this sense of there's a spiritual element to human life. There's an immortal principle to human life. We're not just bodies. So how do these things come together? Well, Christ dies on the cross. He offers his life for humanity, but then he rises again on the third day. The first fruits of salvation, of the resurrection, we see happening in time. And he doesn't rise as a ghost. He says, touch my hands, touch my side to doubting Thomas. And he's there. He eats fish. This isn't some kind of spiritual experience or illusion. It's a corporeal reality as well as a spiritual reality. He's a spiritual body, as Paul says, and that's what we hope for ultimately.
By the way, I've always been struck what an incredible detail that's being told in the scriptures to see, because you look at this and then say, is this is Christ just a ghost? Remember, he kind of walks through the door or what have you, and then it's sort of like, or he disappears from the room or what have you. But then there's that point of, you can physically feel my side, you can physically touch the wound of my hand, you see him eating and so on. It's such a striking thing to include, seemingly to say, this is the nature of the body. This is not just an apparition. This is the twinning of body and spirits, as you're describing in the book. Yeah.
And one thing that Bishop Barron always talks about, I think it's in the Acts of the Apostles, where I believe St. Peter is saying, this Christ whom you crucified, we ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead. And just the ordinariness of that, we all eat and drink every day. We sit down to have breakfast, with our kids and grab a lunch break at work. It's just like part of life is to just have to eat. And of course, Christ in his spiritual body is not having to eat, in the way that we are, but he eats, and his disciples ate and drank with him. So this is a mind-blowing reality. And I think the resurrection of the body, honestly, is an underemphasized dimension of our faith, because a big part of the book is that we're trying to get away from this heavenward Gnostic pull toward thinking the spirit is going to leave this all behind and go to a spiritual heaven forever. And that's eternity, is to be cut away from the body. Well, no, I mean, actually, you read the scriptures and eternity is a physical reality. It's the world joining with heaven. That is what we're destined to be forever and ever and ever, is to be this union of heaven and earth in the resurrected life. So I don't think we can talk about it enough, honestly, the new creation.
So Matt, let's dive into chapter 9, which addresses the good life as discipline or passion. So you write that the heavenward way, discipline, at the expense of the earthward way, passion, can lead to stoicism, whereas the earthward way, passion, at the expense of the heavenward way, discipline, can result in hedonism. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so the discipline or passion tug of war, I'm looking at philosophy in that chapter, but I think we also see it as well in theological debates in the church, debates about pastoral accompaniment of people. I get into it in the rigor relaxation chapter. This idea of discipline is sort of the spiritual top-down principle of dealing with physical, tangible reality. And, it goes back to Plato, this idea of reason being the superior principle, and mastering, your emotions, your physical being, and sort of getting a sense of mastery over it. Obviously, there's great interplay between Platonism and Stoicism. But the person I bring out is Marcus Aurelius in his Meditations, a text that I just read for the first time while writing the book. Obviously, a lot in there that Christians will love and will gravitate toward. And I make the point in the book that you read the New Testament, discipline is very much a theme there. You know, you read, I think, St. Peter 3 different times saying, discipline yourselves. So it's not as if Christians are not called to be disciplined. I think what happens is in Stoicism is you see this emphasis on discipline at the expense of the passions. Pleasure being a primary one, but emotions, all these different sort of bottom up experiences of human life. So I bring forward this passage in the Meditations where Marcus Aurelius is talking about this sort of cold, clammy disgust at eating meat or at drinking wine or at making love and all these different physical, tangible realities that, again, the Gnostics were very emphatic that you needed to separate yourself from. Meat, alcohol, procreation. These were all like very deeply problematic realities in the Gnostic perspective. Would you see the New Testament warning about, certain proto-Gnostic movements were cropping up early on? You see that same theme in Stoicism. And then on the other side, well, what's the dysfunction on the other side is you're seizing passion, you're seizing pleasure, emotion, the bottom-up realities at the expense of that top-down discipline. What's the line from David Hume? He says that reason is the slave of the passions. So now you're flipping away from a Socratic, domination of emotion and pleasure from reason, and then you're inverting it and saying, no, the passions are supposed to enslave reason. The passions are dictating everything that we do. The Catholic both and is those things coming together in a tensive harmony. Again, it's not an easy sort of relationship. We're having to deal with our emotions. We're having to deal with the reality of pleasure. It's not something that we want to deny as evil or sort of a darkened reality. But there is this primacy of disciplining the reality of human passion.
It's very good. It's funny when you're saying this. I was reading this and I started to laugh a little bit because I don't know if you ever read Scoop from Evil and Waugh, but it's kind of a great kind of a comic story of kind of newspaper men and so on. And there's a guy who owns a newspaper, and this sycophantic person with him basically listens to that publisher just yammer on and on and on. And the guy reads the paper listening, and he has two responses. He says, well, of course, sir. And the other one is up to a point, and at one point there's something said and he says up to a point that makes no sense with what was being said. And the publisher keeps talking on because he doesn't listen to the other guy either. But there is a little element as we swing to the poles, and that's not saying being some horrible heresy is up to a point, but there's a certain part of when you're talking about the discipline and passion, you're not saying discipline itself is innately evil, passion itself is innately evil. Right. It's the both and so to some extent, the narrative of this entire book is trying to find that up to a point, this is okay, but understand when you can pass that point and it becomes heretical or becomes damaging or it becomes so warped out beyond what it was meant for. Is that am I being too cavalier in saying that, or does that seem to make sense?
No, that's right on. And the language that I hit on was at one side at the expense of the other. And it's an interesting phrase because it can kind of mean different things. If you're doing something at the expense of something else, it could mean that you're losing it altogether. Yeah. And we do see that in certain figures, certain movements where I think Gnosticism is a clear example. They so seize the heavenly that they just get rid of the earthly altogether. It's like, get it out of here. And then on the earthward side, you'll see this denial of the reality of the heavenly. So it can take the form of sort of pushing it aside and wanting nothing to do with it, seeing it as evil, or it can just be like denying its existence at all, saying it doesn't really even exist in the first place. But then you can also have a subtler form of taking something at the expense of something else. It can be denigrating that reality. It can be not treating it with the respect and the seriousness that it deserves. seeing that this is a deep part of humanity, a deep part of being human. I think in terms of discipline and passion, I think I talk about this in the book, but again, we constantly go back to Christ and the reality of Christ's incarnation. Well, Christ is not some sort of, as he's been portrayed in some movies, just this like distant. I think it's interesting, Jonathan Rumi's presentation in The Chosen, you kind of see that more earthly element come out. But then, what is it, The Greatest Story Ever Told, where you see the more heaven-leaning stoic sort of Jesus. It's hard to capture him on film because he is both of those realities, and you're not going to perfectly get that. But God becomes man, and he takes everything that's human to himself. Nothing human is alien to him, of course, except sin. He has no sin. But that includes passions. That includes, everyday pleasures and emotions. And we see Jesus weeping at the tomb of Lazarus and overturning the tables in the temple. And, we can imagine him as we see, Jonathan Rumi and The Chosen cracking jokes and, just having fun. And Thomas Aquinas in his Summa, even argues at one point that it can be sinful to have a lack of playfulness because being playful is part of being human, So if you're so focused on discipline that you just denigrate any sense of pleasure and passion and joy, everyday, pleasure and passion and joy of life, you're kind of on the wrong path. Another theme on this that I should mention, it's something that I've been thinking about lately, is parenting. So it's an example where I think this hermeneutic can be very helpful in a practical way. I'm a parent. I have 4 kids, and as I was just starting out, there's all this literature, all these debates about parenting styles and techniques. Well, inevitably, I think you find it falling into these two sides that are at loggerheads. And the one side of, parenting that I don't think we all experienced, millennials so much, and maybe older generations did, but is this sense of really intense disciplinary parenting. Children should be seen and not heard, don't speak unless spoken to, and corporal punishment. And it's just a very sort of rigorous disciplinary style of parenting. What have we sort of fallen into today is, I think, more the opposite extreme of just such a total hands-off, gentle, anything you say, therapeutic. You never want to speak a harsh word. And, so I think something as practical as parenting, we find ourselves pulled between this spiritual top-down, no, it has to be this way and that way. And then this sort of flowy, hands-off, anything goes sort of perspective, just experience what you experience. And the Catholic both and is trying to deal with both of these true and good realities of human life, but hold them together somehow. To be firm but gentle is, sort of the phrase that comes to mind.
Well, you just nailed parenting.
I got it all figured out.
But it's interesting because unlike a grade in school, it's sort of like you're constantly saying, am I going this way too far? Am I going that way too far? And it's this balancing act, and it's a complete walk of faith. So it's very well said, Matt. I want to talk about chapter 11, one other chapter. So speaking to knowledge derived from angelic thought or from animal experience. So you tell us the heavenward way, which is thought, at the expense of the earthward way, which is experience, draws its lessons from Descartes.
Yes.
And the earthward way, experience, at the expense of the heavenward way, thought, draws its insights more from David Hume empiricism. So could you say a few words about that?
Yeah, and as I mentioned earlier on in our conversation, Descartes was a principal figure for me. I think it's 3, maybe 4 chapters where I'm dealing with him as sort of the heavenward protagonist. But he's most remembered for this sense of dualism between soul and body, which I do deal with, mentioning Descartes there. But his principal idea was this idea of the cogito and trying to find a solid ground for knowledge. So, we all know things, but we can know things in 2 different ways. We can know things sort of with the crystal clear, operations of logic and reason that are separated from practical experience. Or we can also know things from experience, from intuition, from more practical hands-on matters. So we can know things in both ways, but what's sort of the principal way? I think you see this issue of skepticism creeping up around the time of Descartes. There's this revival in skeptical thought, which says that you can't really know anything at all. And you're left with this sort of throwing your hands up, and all knowledge is, you see this early with Plato, early on wrestling with sophistry, is all these different ideas of, everything's up for grabs and there is no, justice. That's the big debate, of course, in the Republic, is what is justice?
Yeah.
And you see all these different philosophers saying justice is this, justice is that. It's the force of the state. It's, and underlying that is a sort of skeptical perspective where there is no hard and fast truth. And then, of course, Socrates is arguing against that. Well, a similar thing is happening around the time of Descartes, and he wants to find a solid ground for knowledge, to say this is the basis of all knowledge. And he begins with the cogito, which is, I think, therefore I am. Cogito ergo sum. He's dealing with the mental, you want to say consciousness, mental experience is not something that can be doubted. So you can doubt away the existence of God. You can doubt away the existence of the world. You can even doubt away the existence of your own, physical life, your own body. But the fact that you're mentally, consciously having an experience is not something that can be doubted away. So that for him becomes the ground level basis of all experience. And he tries to go from there to work his way back to the existence of God, and then through God to bring us back to the existence of the world. So he's cutting away, I just find it, his whole philosophical program so interesting and so wildly impractical. You talk to any average person and start talking about this, and it just sounds insane. Frankly. I think most people would say this is just insane. And so there is something a little insane about it, but philosophers are insane. What can I say? So he's trying to deal with this issue, and he's landing on pure thought as sort of the basis of knowledge. Well, then on the other hand, you have David Hume, and famously an empiricist. He's focused on experience. He's focused on, as I said before, the passions. Very much an earthward figure in terms of philosophy. And so he's arguing that, well, all of our experience, all of knowledge, all of reality is just a matter of sense impressions. So he famously says, we don't really know for certain whether the sun is going to rise tomorrow. This is just sort of a habit. We see the sun go up, we see the sun go down. We don't know for sure that there's cause and effect in the universe. All we see is one billiard ball hit the other ball. We observe phenomenon A and then phenomenon B, and we put that together and say cause and effect. So he's arguing for a more purified experience, bereft of this sort of top-down thought that Descartes has. Well, beautifully, I think you see in Thomas Aquinas, I think is who I emphasize in this section, but he holds together thought and experience. Chesterton's, to return to the master, Chesterton's biography of Thomas Aquinas is great in this regard, and he brings this out. And then also Etienne Gilson's Thomist Realism is another book I'd recommend for anyone interested in this philosophical dilemma. But the Catholic Church doesn't want to go on the path of pure thought, where you're cutting away practical knowledge, practical experience, nor does it want to cut away the world of pure reason. It wants to try to hold the two together in this harmony.
Yeah, very, very good. So good. Hi, I'm Todd Warner, Managing Editor of Evangelization Culture, the journal of the Word on Fire Institute. Word on Fire is a global evangelical community that exists to provide our members with the resources they need to proclaim Christ to a secular culture. Our award-winning quarterly journal, Evangelization Culture, is offered exclusively to Word on Fire Institute members. It's a tangible representation of our mission and goal to lead with beauty in order to bring others to the knowledge of truth. Inside each issue, you'll find writing from premier scholars and inspiring pieces on literature, culture, and daily life from fellow missionaries on the journey to know and serve Christ. Get a copy of the current issue of the Evangelization Culture Journal for free by visiting wordonfire.org/journal. Thank you, and join us in bringing Christ to a hungry culture. Segment 3. Orthodoxy and the Sprawling Heresies. Returning to his spiritual autobiography, Orthodoxy, Chesterton concludes, quote, "This is the thrilling romance of orthodoxy. People have fallen into a foolish habit of speaking of orthodoxy as something heavy, humdrum, and safe. There never was anything so perilous or so exciting as orthodoxy. It was sanity. And to be sane is more dramatic than to be mad. It was the equilibrium of a man behind madly rushing horses, seeming to stoop this way and to sway that, yet in every attitude having the grace of statuary and the accuracy of arithmetic. It is easy to be a madman. It is easy to be a heretic. It is always easy to let the age have its head. The difficult thing is to keep one's own. It is always easy to be a modernist, as it is easy to be a snob. To have fallen in any one of those open traps of error and exaggeration which fashion after fashion and sect after sect set along the historic path of Christendom, that would indeed have been simple. It is always simple to fall. There are an infinity of angles at which one falls, only one at which one stands. To have fallen into one of the fads from Gnosticism to Christian Science would indeed have been obvious and tame, but to have avoided them all has been one whirling adventure. And in my vision, the heavenly chariot flies thundering through the ages, the dull heresies sprawling and prostrate, the wild truth reeling but erect. Close quote. Again, Matt, all I can say is I read your book and I keep thinking Chesterton. So
that's like the highest compliment you could pay me.
No, it's so good. So in educating us on the heaven-earth dilemma, you point out heresies or ideologies that are emblematic of the extremes. And clearly, you have an encyclopedic knowledge of theology and philosophy as you write this book. Matt, would you say heresies, are they simply truths stretched out of their original proportions and thus morphed into a funhouse mirror deformity of the truth?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I discovered this while working on the book, that the word heresy comes from the Greek for choice, which is so fascinating to me. I think we actually tend to think of heresy in almost the opposite way, that it's like bringing a jumbled, set of ideas together.
Yeah.
Whereas the origin of it is to say you're choosing one thing, again, at the expense of the other. What that does result in, again, as you say, is this funhouse mirror perspective of the faith. In that third part of the book on the history of the church, as I said at the outset, it's sort of where the rubber meets the road in terms of Catholicity, in terms of making the case that the Catholic Church is the fullness of the way. Because you do see heresies crop up. You do see movements already in the New Testament. What does St. John said? Whoever denies that Christ has come in the flesh is the Antichrist. So you're already having proto-Gnostic movements crop up early in the church. The Judaizers, all these different things. So how do we deal with it? And obviously a lot of Protestants would say, well, we look to the scriptures. That's the final court of appeal. The point that I make in that last section is that scripture itself, I think, beautifully and importantly, has the same tensions. It has the same both ands. One thing I do in each of the chapters in the last part is to say, you find scripture passages that are used and can be used to support this heavenward or earthward perspective, because it does seem to fall pretty strongly. It's making an emphasis on one side of it. But on the other hand, you do see scripture passages that are emphasizing the other side. It's one totality of the scriptures, and you need to try to see the whole. Again, it's hard for us as finite human beings. We latch onto one thing or the other. I think you often see Protestants latching on to St. Paul. Much of what he says, can be marshaled out in defense of more heavenward perspectives. But you also have to read the letter of St. James. You also have to read, the Old Testament, and keep everything together. It's a balancing act. And I think the church beautifully down the centuries has dealt with these heresies and saying they've departed from the way, and it's dealt with them and saying that this can't be a part of the authentic faith, through ecumenical councils. You mentioned, the Nicene Creed early in our conversation is one of the prototypical examples of that. But the church has, down its history, tried to walk that way. And to me, that's the test case, is to say, is the Catholic Church the church that Christ came to found and wants everyone to be a part of? Based on everything that we've said, to me, the test is, how well does it walk the way? How well does it follow Christ in drawing together heaven and earth? Well, I think it's condemnation of the heresies are saying you're choosing the heavenly or the earthly at the expense of the other side, and it can't be a part of the Christian journey.
And isn't that what the custodian of the faith is supposed to do? It's supposed to say, whoa, we're going too far this way, we're going too far that way. And this is, again, to Chesterton, there's no other living institution that has for 2,000 years been thinking about thinking and drawing the map of the mind and showing us the blind alleys and the dead ends that have only been identified because we've gone down them already and we found out that's the wrong place. And I love that he says, 9 out of 10 something like 9 out of 10 of new ideas are old heresies, that we've tried from time to time. And the church is there to say, what, don't bite on that.
Been there, done that.
Yeah. So I was going to ask you, so the poet Alfred Tennyson once warned, a lie which is a half-truth is ever the blackest of lies. And so I'm curious about, are the heretical heavenward or earthward extremes easy for us to fall into because they are, in effect, tempting half-truths back to the funhouse mirror? Is that sort of the allure that they have a little bit of truth on the trap, and then you take a bite and then you realize, but it's not the whole truth? What's your sense about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I try to do in each chapter is to acknowledge that truth that the side was hitting on, which wasn't always easy to do. And I think is a good exercise for us as we're dealing with the clash of ideas. We all have our own biases. We all have our own beliefs. But Thomas Aquinas, I think, is the master in this, because what does he do when he deals with an issue? He tries to steelman the argument, and he says, here's the objection, here's the objection, here's, and he brings forward 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 really good objections. And you read those and think, I don't know how he's going to answer. I don't know how I would answer these. I don't know how on earth he's going to answer these. So he's trying to show the strongest position for the other side. Then he responds, saying, no, it's this. And then he step by step responds to the objections. So I think having nuance, seeing what's true in a certain perspective is important, because I do think ultimately it is that nugget of truth. It is that half truth that allures us. We're seizing onto something true and good and beautiful, a part of human experience, a part of the faith, whatever it might be. The problem is we're narrowing our perspective, and we're losing that Catholic whole. We're losing the sense of thinking according to the whole, which is what Catholic means. And it's so easy to do. Again, it's just part of living in a fallen, finite reality. But that's why we have the church. That's why we have the scriptures. It's a constant calibration of our own patterns of thought, a constant testing of where we are, is to look to the councils, to look to the magisterium, and to kind of examine ourselves. And are we seizing on one truth at the expense of the other?
In cardiology, there's this physics called the Starling curve. It's the physics of the heart and its performance, where just the right volume of blood facilitates the optimal pumping capacity. So in other words, if there's too little blood, someone's bleeding, someone's dehydrated, or too much volume, they have kidney failure, liver failure, or heart failure. Those things compromise the heart's pumping function. And likewise, more towards a childlike version of the same point. In the Three Bears, between chairs, meals, and beds, Goldilocks is persistently trying to find her way to just right.
Yes.
So my question for you is, as you've written this book, is this sort of our fumbling lot in life? Are we doomed to sort of imperfectly oscillate between the poles, or is there hope that with proper formation and discipline, with prayer and grace, that we can actually find our way?
Yeah, it's a very good question. One thing I would say first, in terms of the Goldilocks image, and we have a lot of analogies from the physical world, and I love the Chesterton quote at the beginning of too tall, too short, a man who's just the right size. I think an issue with that is we can kind of fall into thinking, well, you have these two principles on either side. The Catholic truth must be sort of a halving of each to meet in the middle, which is not really the Catholic both and. As Chesterton beautifully says, the church has a hatred of pink. It loves red. It loves white. It wants both colors. I think of the Polish flag because I'm part Polish, but both red and white flying gloriously. It doesn't want this sort of gray. It doesn't want this sort of pink that compromises both sides. But on the other hand, how do we live that out? We can't be everything all the time. We have to make decisions as we go about our day. We have to find our particular vocation. We have our own passions, our own interests that we want to bring to the life of the church. And that's beautiful. I think it's part of, it's sort of an act of humility to say, I believe in the fullness of truth. I believe all these things are coming together in the church, but I don't have them all. I bring my little, my little gifts and what I can contribute. But I'm not going to perfectly capture the balance, and nobody is except Christ, who we participate in. A quote, I have an appendix at the back of the book with all these different quotes. Of course, Chesterton is in there quite a lot. But a quote that's really stuck out for me, as the book has gone to the printer and I put it behind me, is de Lubac. He has this line where he says, "The coherent plenitude after which we aspire can never, in our present condition, be anything but an aspiration," which I think is such a beautiful line. He's basically saying we're all after this fullness of reality. It's what we long for. It's what we believe. It's what we participate in. But in this finite fallen reality, it's just it can never get beyond this sense of an aspiration. Well, does that mean we throw our hands up and just say, well, forget it, I just want to go with something simpler and easier? No, we keep aspiring. So I think it's beautifully capturing this sense of we're not going to fully get there. We're not going to fully encompass the both and, but nevertheless, we keep getting precise. We keep aspiring. We keep trying to follow Christ as fully as we can. One of the great promises I see in the digital revolution, granted, there's tons of peril. You look at AI, who apparently Pope Leo is going to be a big theme of his pontificate. There's a lot to be worried about. But I think one of the signs of hope is that the digital age brings the history of ideas before our eyes in a way like nobody in history has ever had the opportunity to do, which I find really fascinating. Is that all these debates, all these arguments, the history of literature, like, I don't know why we're all wasting our time sharing memes and scrolling through Instagram, which I'm doing just like everybody else. But it's all there for us to delve into and to try to get better about and try to understand the history of our faith. And it's something I think to really be excited about. So yeah, we'll never quite get there, but we keep aspiring to it.
So Matt, one final question. On a personal note, what if you could characterize it or boil it down to a lesson or two, what are the greatest lessons you've learned in writing this book, and how have you been changed by what you've learned?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the greatest lessons I learned as I was writing it was it's really a examine. As I mentioned before, I think it's a chance to sort of examine your own biases. As I was teasing out this pattern of the heavenly and the earthly and the two coming together. And by the way, I don't think one thing I've mentioned enough, if at all, was that the heavenly principle has a primacy, which is so important. One of the ways that we can get off track, especially in dilemmas of Christianity, is taking the earthly principle and putting it on top. So let's say like the city of man is sort of becoming our primary focus over the kingdom of heaven, building up the earthly city over the heavenly Jerusalem. The here and now, famously modernism is, focused on the here and now as opposed to the not here and the not yet. That latter reality has to have the primacy. So as I teased out, that rule and sort of the formula, it forced me to confront ways that I had gotten off track and things that I had taken for granted as true that maybe weren't true. One chapter that used to be a whole part, I later whittled it down to a single chapter, which we didn't touch on, was society. I think it's the issue of polarization, which the conversation started with, is something very much on everyone's minds. How are we so polarized, and what do we do about it? I think in America, there's this real deep sense of our having lost a sense of unity, politically, socially. So yeah, I think the book and the argument of the way of heaven and earth has changed me in that it's sort of forced me as a Catholic, as a human being, to confront my own biases and to try to get clearer about what I believe and why. And I would just return to that last point about de Lubac, is that I think it's easy for somebody like me to, when I hear a debate, to say, "Oh, it's both and," and that's the end of the story. But it's a struggle. There's a lot of suffering that I think comes with entering into this path and trying to live it out as best as you can. Rachel Bullman had a very kind blurb for the book, and she was talking about the more spiritual, moral dimensions of trying to follow Christ, which is interesting because the book is more rationalistic. It's not really hitting on that so much, but it is in the background. We're all trying to follow Christ as best as we can. And so the moral and spiritual implications of trying to walk the way, of trying to follow Christ and drawing together heaven and earth, it's a participation in his suffering. It's a participation in his death and ultimately in his resurrection.
Matthew Becklo, author, Word on Fire publishing director, and champion of the great Catholic both and. Thank you. It has been such a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you, Todd. Great to chat with you.
So I've been thinking, man, can we go sideways? Reading Matt Becklo's book, The Way of Heaven and Earth, reveals just how easily we can wander, even earnestly, off the straight path. As G.K. Chesterton reminds, quote, "It is always simple to fall. There are an infinity of angles at which one falls, only one at which one stands. To have fallen into any one of the fads, from Gnosticism to Christian Science, would indeed have been obvious and tame," close quote. But isn't that an interesting notion? It is always simple to fall. The devil tempts us with meager fruits that temporarily satisfy our appetites for honor, power, pleasure, and wealth. It doesn't take much. Just a little something for your lust, your pride, or your sloth. Just a little slip, and you're hooked. Just another sad soul in hell. And yet, avoiding such a failure, refusing temptation, fighting off sin and heresy is no heavy, humdrum, or safe existence. It is, in fact, what Chesterton dubs one whirling adventure. The Way of Heaven and Earth explores the bad ideas that were, for a time, and by some, deemed good, as well as the Church's, the custodian of the God's truth, incomparable duty to defend Christ's truth, even if it leads to the cross, to the gallows, or to the grave. It unfolds the way we hedge and bend, shift and slide away from doing the right thing. A road that forks begins as a minor deviation, but it ends worlds apart. But Matt's book also shows us the right path, a path that is not simply the middle way, but the Master's way. It is a path of justice and mercy, accountability and forgiveness, and it is arrived at by thorough formation, sacramental participation, and the endless stream of God's grace. The Way of Heaven and Earth is not a book that frightens us into immobility lest we tip too far this way or fall too far that way. And it isn't a book that scolds us into becoming the next studied iteration of St. Thomas Aquinas. Rather, it shows that even though sin brazenly beckons, Christ gloriously delivers. This is a heartening message for the wayward. God's way is the way home. And one last thing. Of course, you should read Matt Becklo's The Way of Heaven and Earth for a great exploration of the Catholic both and. But I'm also going to point you back to G.K. Chesterton's pair of books, Heretics and Orthodoxy, which keenly dissect the prevailing fashionable opinions or heresies of the day, as well as Chesterton's ultimate arrival, in part because of the off-putting nature of these modern heresies, into the arms of the Catholic Church. Thank you once again for joining me on the Evangelization Culture Podcast. I'm Todd Warner, and until we meet again, keep bringing Christ to a hungry culture.